Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. This is your today's edition of The Law and You. I'm your host, Attorney Shellon Washington. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon. And this afternoon, we will be discussing divorces. And I think this is a really important topic we need to discuss because I feel like a lot of people out there are stuck in relationship. They're experiencing relationship issues. They're married to the person, but for some reason, some people seems to like misery. And for people who are religious in particular, they tend to believe that it's God's will that they should remain in a miserable situation. When in reality, God has nothing to do with if you're in a miserable relationship or not. A lot of times that's people's choice. People make choices, and one of those could be a bad choice to end up in the wrong relationship. So today we're going to speak about divorces in Guyana and in the United States. I have talked to you before about divorces in the United States. So today we're going to touch a little bit about the divorces in Guyana because the grounds are a little bit different. While in the United States, we tend to have no fault, what is called no fault divorce. In Guyana, they're still a little bit stuck in, the different or various grounds for divorce. Some of the grounds that they still stuck with in Guyana for divorces include adultery, cruelty, and malicious desertion. Now, we don't have those, we still have them technically in the state of New York, but they're not, widely utilized. Most people do not use those grounds to get a divorce. Now, if someone wants a divorce in New York, it's simply a no fault. In New Jersey also. But in Guyana, I think we're still stuck in the old system. So there haven't been much revision or revamping of the law there. So now if you need a divorce in Guyana, it's either adultery, cruelty, or malicious desertion. Now, let's talk about a little bit about adultery. Adultery is one of the most leading causes of divorces in Guyana and in other places around the world. That's not, I think that's, if anyone was to choose a reason for a divorce in Guyana, it would be adultery, because that's the most widely factor that contributes towards a lot of divorces. It contributes towards issues at home, problems, difficulties, how spouses unable to get along with each other because somebody has stepped out of the marriage and is being unfaithful. So adultery, leading cause for divorces in Guyana. And then I would say right behind adultery, you'll find cruelty because there's a lot of instances where there's domestic violence in the home, and the domestic violence terribly affects the children in the home. So that would be one of the second leading causes, I think, in Guyana. Not to forget that even in cruelty, there's also the financial aspect of it that leads to the divorces in countries like Guyana. So the highest, adultery, then cruelty. Then we have the other one, malicious desertion. Malicious desertion, not so popular, but it happens a lot also. A lot of people tend to desert their home, their matrimonial home. I saw this very often as a child growing up in Guyana, where a spouse would just abandon the home and just leave and just go somewhere else. This is a very, very popular thing you will see in Guyana. A man would leave his home and he would gone for several days and not return. And, the family would be wondering, where is he? There was no way to contact him or communicate with him because he wouldn't pick the phone up. So this is one of the other factors, and it goes hand in hand with adultery, believe it or not, malicious desertion. They basically desert the home, matrimonial home. They just pick up and they just leave without telling the spouse, like, hey, we're having problems. I don't want to remain in this relationship. I just want to be free. I just want to go. And I think if people are being educated and they understand that a lot of times it's just best to sit and have a conversation with your spouse rather than to pack your bags, get up, walk through the door, and leave that person hanging. And then you have young children. You have minor children in the home, and they're wondering, where's my dad? Or where's my mom? And either spouse, the one whosoever it is, just picked up and left the matrimonial home. And the children are wondering what happened to that particular parent that's just picked up and left. And just to be clear, that this whole desertion situation is not just men. It's men or women. A lot of times women too desert matrimonial home. They too pick up and leave minor children with the husband, and they're just gone. I've seen several situations like this where the wife actually was the one who left. It's less frequent than where the situation where the male leaves, but nonetheless, it happens. So those are your leading causes for divorce or leading grounds for divorce. We have adultery leading as number one. We have cruelty leading as number two. And then number three, we have malicious desertion. And I want to tell you guys, if you're in a situation with a marriage where your partner and you're not getting along, you're not dealing with each other in love and with unity and with, wisdom, don't sit and be cruel to the other party, or don't sit in a situation that could become deadly, because we've seen this too many times, especially in Guyana. You have two spouses, they're not getting along with each other for whatever the reason is. So sometimes the malicious desertion is sometimes the best option, because when those people stay together and they're not getting along with each other, you can have a volatile situation and somebody could end up being statistics. We see this too many times in Guyana, domestic violence, where you have a murder suicide, where one of the spouse kill the other spouse and then commit suicide. Murder suicide situation. So to avoid those problems, listen, if you're in a home with a husband or a wife and you see that it's not working, either your finances is not working and the two of you are constantly fighting, you're constantly having heavy dispute where you're using words in front of each other to hurt the other party, and then there's children there that is suffering as a result of what's going on between the parent, I would advise you the best thing to do is to separate. And then let's talk a little bit about separation. Now, if you want a divorce, there's two ways to do this. You can separate first and then divorce later on. Because a lot of times people separate, but they don't want to divorce because they have assets together and they're thinking, how are we going to, resolve this problem with the assets? Let me tell you, I've seen it so many times where the parties are not living together, but there's a house. There's a house. And one of the spouse remains in the house, continue to pay for the house, and one of the spouse is gone. And then the question arises that what happens to the house if they live apart for 20 years and then they decide to file a divorce after that? So this is something you need to think about carefully before you get up and run from the matrimonial home. Think about what's going to happen to your assets. If he has a pension, you have a pension, and you want to figure that out before you just pick up, run from the matrimonial home and desert your position there. Now, let's talk a little bit about the separation part. Now, there's something called a separation agreement. For those of you who don't know, I did speak before on this show about prenuptials. The prenuptials, and there's also post-nuptials. The prenuptials are usually entered into before you get married. If you have assets, if you inherit something from your family and you don't want somebody as spouse to come in and then claim that they contribute towards your asset and then claim an entitlement to your asset, what I advise people to do is get a prenup. So if you have a prenuptial now and you get married, you don't have to worry about your asset. But in a case where the parties just decided, okay, let's just get married. I don't care about my asset. I don't care about yours. What's yours is mine and what's mine is yours. That is a very dangerous position to be in. But if you decide to do that and you get into a marriage with somebody and you have asset and the person have asset, you could still decide to do what is called a post-nuptial. It's still not too late. It's only late after you start getting problems and then you decide, okay, it's best for us to go our separate ways. When you decide that, what comes into play now is a separation agreement. Now, you want to think clearly when you think about the separation agreement, because at that point, you'd have already commingled your assets together. There would have already been some form of putting your asset, mixing your funds, mixing assets together, acquiring things together. So now you want to do a separation agreement before she runs or he runs. Sit together, think it through, and come up with a plan to get a separation agreement. Now, you might not be able to formulate the separation agreement on your own, and I would not advise you to do that. So I would tell you to consult an attorney. You can consult my office at any point if you think, okay, I'm not getting along with my spouse, I need a separation agreement. Now, the separation agreement is going to put everything into writing. So if you have assets, the two of you could agree like, okay, you're going to keep the car, I'm going to keep my car, you keep yours. And then the house, we're going to split the house 50-50, or we're going to split the house 30-40, whatever match you choose to do. Or, let's say 80-20, depending on who contribute the most to the property. You could sit down and discuss these things before you decide to separate. And before he goes find another woman and she goes find another man and decide to shack up while they're still in a marriage. Because as you know, a lot of times people just run. They don't want a divorce, but they just don't want to deal with the spouse. But there's assets that you need to consider before you get up and go and shack up in another relationship with somebody. Think about your assets first. Think about what's going to happen if you ever decide that, listen, let's go, just go ahead and divorce. Now, the separation agreement, it has to be formalized. It has to say specifically what assets both party has, and it has to say specifically what you're going to do and how you're going to divide those assets. So that's what you do instead of just leaving the matrimony home, not knowing what's going to happen to you or your asset once you leave. If you formalize it and put it into writing, execute that document, both parties. When later down the road you decide, okay, let's divorce at that point, because we've already separated for a number of years. You've been living your life. I've been living my life. Now I'm ready for us to just formalize this into a divorce, because now I found somebody that I think I would like to remarry. But the only hindrance right now is because we're still legally bound together. So now the next step is you're going to think about, how am I going to divorce this party? It's going to be much, much easier at that point, because once you have a separation agreement in place, you don't have to deal with the entire issue of, equitable distribution, how you're going to separate your assets, how you're going to divide whatever you acquire during the marriage. That's not going to be a factor no more. All that's going to happen is you're going to go to court. You're going to file the divorce petition in Guyana. It's a petition. In the United States, it's a divorce complaint, a summons and a complaint. You file those documents, and then both parties could easily agree and sign the documents that are required to be filed with the court in order for them to get a judgment of divorce. Now, that's going to make your life work out so much easier than having to work through all of the issues of all the ancillary issues which involve, equitable distribution, child support, spousal support, all those things, because you would have dealt with those things in your separation agreement. So if one spouse decide they're going to keep the children if they're minor children of the marriage, and then the other one says, well, okay, I'll pay you child support, those are issues you would have already worked out. And let me tell you, it's better to work out issues when you're at peace with each other than when you're at war with each other, because once the parties separate, one spouse separate, things get ugly. And you don't want to be in a position where things are ugly and then you're trying to say, well, okay, I am entitled to this and you're entitled to that. Because I've seen some really, really ugly situations with clients. And then at that point, it becomes like, how are they going to come to this position without the court's intervention? And let me tell you, a matrimonial trial are very, very costly. It costs a lot of money. So for those of you who would have gone to a trial before, a divorce trial, in the United States is very costly. It's also costly in Guyana, because even though in Guyana it's less intense in terms of the evidence it has to produce, the discovery period, it's still costly. You have to pay your attorney to go to court, to do all the fact finding, to cross-examine and examine witnesses on your behalf, and make sure the evidence is properly presented to the judge. Same thing in the United States, except in New York, what will happen is you have to do a whole lengthy process called discovery, where you get all the evidence out to figure out what type of evidence will be used to establish your case or your claim. So if you're claiming that, look, we have a house together, but although we have a house together, I'm the one who's been contributing most of the money towards the house. And one thing that people don't know with divorces is that there are a lot of presumptions. I'm not sure how many of you know what a presumption is, but there are various presumptions in divorce proceedings. And a presumption simply means that the court is going to presume certain things and conclude certain things even before the evidence is presented. Like, for instance, a child born during a marriage is presumed to be a child of the marriage, even though it might be somebody else's child being born to the woman, but the child is presumed to be a child of the marriage. It's presumed that it's the child of your husband. Similarly, as it relates to your assets are presumed to be marital assets until you could establish otherwise. A lot of times people just believe that, hey, if I'm contributing more to the house, automatically, if we decide to divorce, the house is mine. But it doesn't work that way, period, because these presumptions sometimes does not always operate in your favor, because a presumption is put into place so that the court could rely on certain things unless the party is able to prove otherwise by establishing evidence to show. So the presumption that each party is entitled to equitable distribution, meaning each party might be entitled to 50-50%, that percentage could change based on the evidence you're able to show to the court that, hey, listen, I provided most of everything during the marriage. I worked, I was the sole breadwinner. Also, I cooked, I came home, I cooked because my spouse was lazy, I cleaned, I took care of the children. So that spouse is obviously of more benefit to the union because that spouse is contributing a lot. Whereas if you have a spouse, and I've seen this before, where let's say it's the man that is working, he comes home, he cooks, he takes care of the children, and then he has a wife who doesn't work and she's super lazy. She doesn't want to do anything but lie in the bed, or vice versa. It could be a husband that is that type of person, and the person who is doing the least is the person who is entitled to the least. There's another thing that the court tend to assume, because these are all presumption. It's assumed that your spouse, even though your spouse is not working, like your spouse is contributing emotional support towards you. Your spouse is cooking, they're cleaning, and they're doing things around the home, they're working in the home. But if you could establish that all these factors are not true, then obviously the presumption is going to be shifted more to your side. But you want to avoid having to go to court and establish that you're the one who's been doing most of everything in your marriage, and that it's really you the one who's entitled to 60% of all the equity in any asset that the marriage might have. In order to prevent that, I would say prenuptial, postnuptial, or separation agreement. I would go with any of those three, but I would advise you, all of you listening here, and those people who are going to listen to this video at some point, that the best thing to do is to be on good terms with your spouse when you're trying to discuss either prenuptial, postnuptial, or separation agreement. Now, the separation agreement will be a little bit more tricky because oftentimes people are bitter at the time they're trying to separate. When people get to the point where they're like, oh, let's separate, we can't live together anymore, we're not getting along, this looks like we might end up in divorce. When it gets to that stage, usually it's not very good. So a lot of times it's always better to discuss these things before you get into a marriage, and don't let people put you on a guilt trip to make you feel like, oh, it's not a good idea to do a prenup before you get married, because then you make people feel like you intend to divorce. But that's not even true. When you do a prenuptial, you're doing two things. You're telling the person, hey, I love you, but if anything should go wrong, I want the both of us to be happy. I don't want us to be fighting. I don't want us to have to figure out how we're going to settle our affairs after that. So let's kind of do this before we do that. Before we put a ring on, let's kind of make sure we iron out our affairs, that if anything should go wrong later on, at least these things are in place. And just know that the prenup is just not a one-sided document, because some people just think that since you hear the word prenup, and let's say one spouse has assets, they just automatically think that, hey, the prenup is to protect the person with the money. That is not true. The prenup is really to protect both sides. Is to protect the spouse with money, and to also protect the spouse who doesn't have money, which is called the money spouse, is called the money spouse, and the one who doesn't have any asset is the non-money spouse, or the no money spouse. And the prenup protects both sides, because what you do is both sides get their own attorneys, the attorney review, the attorney will help to put provisions there to protect the spouse who doesn't have any asset, that if there should be a separation after 5 years or 10 years, that the spouse with money would ensure that they give them a portion of their asset, so that that spouse wouldn't just walk out into the world empty-handed with nothing to support themselves. Because, as you know, in Guyana is the worst place to be divorcing. You could get a wrong deal in Guyana because the law is so skewed to protect the spouse who has money and who has assets. I've told you guys about a story, a case that I had, one of the first divorce cases that I did in Guyana, where the woman had like 5 children and she was like pregnant, and the husband, he just wanted a divorce. So his mother, the paper that his mother put in for him to come to the United States so that he can leave his pregnant wife and come to the United States. And I don't know if he had any intentions of going back and remarrying her, but the law was so crazy that there was no provision, even though that woman was at home taking care of all those children, putting a stress and a toll on her body to take care of those children. The law didn't make any provision to make sure that she was well taken care of. Yeah, the law had provision to take care of the children, which is called child support, but that has nothing to do with her, who sacrificed her life to stay home and carry these children for this man, and had 5 children and was pregnant at the time of the divorce. So the prenup is actually more useful than you people might think. A lot of people think it's a bad thing, but I tell you differently. I beg to differ. It's more protective, and it's more like a safety net for you if you're the non-money spouse. So if you're getting married and you're listening to this program, I would advise you to consider a prenup, a postnuptial, and a prenuptial. And if you're already married, you could consider a postnuptial. The separation agreement is if you already decided that you don't want to stay together, but you're still on speaking terms. And I find most times when the parties are on good terms is when I kind of feel like when the wife messes up, when the female messes up, that's when the parties are more likely to be on good terms, where they can talk to each other and say, well, we're not going to stay together. Because I can tell you, I've seen a situation where the wife is the one who actually stepped out on the husband, and he's not even that bitter, but for some reason they have some sort of issue. At first they were able to talk, he's still able to talk, but then the wife became it came to a point where they're not even on speaking terms no more. So it becomes difficult now to say, okay, let's do a post-nap, because now they're in divorce proceedings, and you don't want to end up in divorce proceedings and you're not on speaking terms, because that could go really, really bad. And then you could end up getting hurt, because a lot of times I've also seen situations where the parties end up before the court, and because they're unable to settle, and the court, listen, people, judges are humans just like you and I. A lot of them don't even know what they're doing also, and they rely heavily on people like me, the attorneys, to tell them, to guide them, to show them what the law is. And if the attorneys who appear before the judge, or they themselves know no better, the judge might be an incompetent fool also. I've seen a situation where a judge make a pronouncement on lands in Guyana, and the judge himself did not even know that land in any country, the country is sovereign because of this principle of sovereignty. Any country is sovereign, and the land on which the country owns, those lands are sovereign to the country. And if any country wants to make any pronouncement on the land in those countries, it must, the law says, this is international principle. It said it must defer to the laws of the situs, the law of the country where the land is located. I've seen this happen to a Guyanese man. It's a Guyanese couple. They went, and this judge imprudently made a decision on lands in Guyana. He didn't even know what the laws in Guyana was. And when I tried to school him, I tried to tell him, like, listen, I tried to re-argue because the case was already messed up. The man went to an attorney who really, really messed him up. And the judgment is really bad. The judgment is bad law, bad precedent. But by the time he got to me, it was too late to file an appeal. The law says you have 30 days after a notice of entry is served. And he came to me almost 2 years later. So all I could have done is re-argue. File a motion to re-argue, because the time is already gone. I had to find clever ways to get myself back in front of the court to say, well, listen, this is bad law. And even though I'm telling the judge this is bad law, he's telling me, oh, I should bring a Supreme Court decision to show him. And I'm saying, Judge, there's no appellate court. He wants an appellate court decision to tell him that laws in a country, if you're making any ruling on the laws in any country, you need to defer to the laws of that country, because that land is sovereign to that country. And you cannot use the laws of the United States, the laws of New York, to make any pronouncement on land that is located in Georgetown, Guyana, or any part again. That is a bad decision. And I told him, no judge would be that dumb to make that decision and make it get before the appellate division, because it's going to be struck down. It's going to be struck. It's bad on many levels. And people of Guyana need to understand this. Not just Guyana, but people, period, in the Caribbean need to understand. Don't let any judge in the United States make any decision on land that you have in a foreign country. You could sign a stipulation between you and your spouse, and you can say, okay, this is what we're going to do with the land. But the judge has no jurisdiction over the land in Guyana unless you consent and say, okay, you can rule on it, but apply the laws of the sitters. He has to apply the laws of the sitters. To do anything else is bad law, bad decision that is just waiting to be struck down because it's avoidable order or judgment. The judgment is voidable. When somebody recognizes it's voidable and go to the court will easily recognize and say, well, this is bad law, it's void, and strike it down as incorrect application of the law. So I want to let you know that in particular, when it comes to the land in a foreign country and you dealing with it in another country, you have to be very, very careful with that. The laws in Guyana is not very protective of a woman. And I think they need to change that, where they protect the woman more, protect the rights of a woman more, protect the rights of mothers more, protect the rights of a family. The man is protected. I mean, not so much when it comes to domestic violence situation. That's a whole different topic that we can talk about at some other time. But, just period, ensure that there is equity done when the parties are divorcing. Even in the marital law, it says if you're divorcing, the party who contributed the most to the land, even if the land is in joint names, that's the party's entitled to that land. And the people in Guyana, the legislator, need to look at these laws more carefully, and they need to say, what is equity? How can we do things in a way that is equitable, that's going to be beneficial to both parties? Guyana is probably the only country I know where a husband and a wife could be on bad terms, and the house is in the man's name, and he throw the wife out and lock the door, throw her stuff out in the yard, in the front lawn, and lock the door, and she can't get back in. That's probably the only country I know that you can actually do things like this, because in the United States, the police would show up and tell you got to let that spouse back into the house. You can't throw nobody out like that. That doesn't work in, certain countries. And I think we have to get up to speed with the times and recognize that some of the things we're doing is wrong, and we're going about it in a wrong way. And the law permits us to do that because there's no safety net. And the law needs to be revamped. It needs to be revised so that they will take into account all of these humanitarian issues. The law should change. I know my internet, I think it went out a little bit there, but I think I'm back now. So these are some of the things that needs to be changed. It needs to be revised. It needs to be revamped. And if you're contemplating a divorce, and if you have dual citizenship, if you're either resident in Guyana or in the United States, in New York, and both spouses have residency here, I would say file the divorce in New York. Don't go to Guyana and file the divorce. A lot of times what people do, if they have both spouses living in New York and then they have a property in Guyana, they will run to Guyana and try to file the divorce there. And they will use the term domicile. They will say, I'm domiciled in Guyana, which is a blatant lie. A lot of times they're not even domiciled. But because of the crazy way Guyana defines domicile, it opens the door for people who are living, working, doing everything in the United States to go to Guyana and to file a divorce by claiming that they're domiciled in Guyana when they're not even living in Guyana. They're not even there. They're not even there in Guyana. They're not even there. So, that's one of the things you need to consider if you want to file for divorce. Which is the better jurisdiction to file the divorce in? Separation agreement versus divorce. It's always good if you want to separate. Put together your separation agreement, consult with an attorney, get that done right, get everything done right up front before you walk out the door and separate from your wife or your husband, so that the house that you have in your joint names, you know exactly what's going to happen to it 10, 20 years down the line. If you want to leave it to your children, if you want to say my interest goes to my children, that could be a part of that separation agreement. Because once it gets before the court takes control over your life. Then you don't want to give no judge the opportunity to rule over your affairs, things that you've worked so many years for, and to tell the judge, here, take my life, make a decision for my life. Don't do that with yourself. Come together as civil human beings, husband and wife, make those decisions first, then separate, so that if at any point in the future you need to go to court, it's just for the court to pronounce and say you're divorced. It's just to present the paperwork to the judge or the referee, whoever it is, and say we just want an uncontested divorce. It's a dangerous thing for when you take your life and put it in the hands of one foolish man or woman who never live a day in your house, don't know what happens in your household, and they're going to make decisions for you, which, by the way, could be grossly erroneous or inequitable. A lot of those judges do not know what they're doing, and I can call names, but I'm not going to do that on this show. I can do that at some other point. If they continue to do the crazy things that they're doing, maybe then I can consider exposing them. But a lot of those judges do not know anything about your life. So make sure you have your separation agreement. Or if you're not married, do your prenup. If you're already married, do your postnup. If you're living together and you're happy and everything is going fine, you could still do a postnup. Your spouse shouldn't have any difficulty with that. Or if you've already decided, like, we're not working out, and like some people, they're living as roommates, like the previous mayor of New York. He said him and his wife are not sleeping in the same room. So, if you're at that point where you're sleeping on separate beds in different rooms, you can probably still go and get an agreement, a separation agreement between each other, and say, well, okay, this is the route we're going in, so we might as well execute this separation agreement now. Now, guys, I can continue this later at a different time. We can continue to speak about divorces and about your prenup, your postnup, or your separation agreement. Again, it was a pleasure spending this half an hour with you. I'm your host again, Shellon Washington, an attorney in Guyana and also in Brooklyn, New York. So I'm so grateful. I thank you so much for the time we spent here together. If you got any questions, concerns, call my office. I will put the number as soon as I'm off this program today. You can call at any time, free consultation. And also, if there's any other legal issue that you might have, you can call, you can ask legal questions. I might not always be available, but we'll try our best to answer all of your questions. Thank you so much for staying here with me this afternoon. And I will see you again back next week, Saturday at 4 p.m. on The Law and You, right here on 107.1 FM. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great rest of your weekend. So this is attorney Shellon Washington, owner and founder of the Washington Law Firm, located at 455 Utica Avenue in Brooklyn, New York. We're specialized in medical malpractice, personal injuries, matrimonial law, and landlord and tenant. If you're in need of legal representation, please give us a call today. The number to call is 718-877-3100. Consultation is free at no cost to you. So call us today to see if we can be of any assistance to your legal needs. Again, the phone number to call us is 718-877-3100.